On my son's wedding day, more than 500 guests watched my in-laws point at me and laugh. They called me a burden, the lowest kind of man, nothing more than a bankrupt old fool in a cheap suit who should feel grateful just to stand in the same room as them. My daughter-in-law, wrapped in a $50,000 wedding gown, laughed louder than anyone. She truly believed my son had won the jackpot by marrying into her family. What none of them realized was that the second I walked away, they had already triggered the worst mistake of their lives. Every disaster that followed began in that ballroom. Welcome back to Dad's real life revenge. Grab a drink, get comfortable, and remember this. Everyone in these stories had the chance to do the right thing. They simply chose not to. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, because I'd love to see how far this story reaches. The smell of leftover food drifted from the kitchen, while waves of heat rolled through the service door behind me. Inside the Grand Hotel ballroom, the Sterling family had placed me at table 44, where forgotten people were quietly pushed out of sight. Crystal chandeliers filled the room with light, exposing the polished lies beneath all the luxury. Catherine Sterling's diamonds flashed around her neck like tiny blades. I folded my hands in my lap, painfully aware that my worn suit didn't belong among the custom Italian tuxedos worn by people who believed wealth made them untouchable. Then I looked at my son, Darius. He stood on the stage, pale and silent, already being humiliated by the woman he was about to marry. Rowan crossed the marble floor toward me, each step of her high heels cutting through the room. She didn't look at me like family. She looked at me like something dirty that should have been cleaned up before the guests arrived. Leaning close enough for her expensive perfume to choke the air, she whispered that I was ruining every wedding photo simply by being there. The Sterling family burst into laughter. It wasn't celebration, it was public execution. Devlin Sterling lifted a glass of wine worth more than some people earned in a month and announced that the noble Sterling bloodline should never be polluted by an unemployed old man from the suburbs. Darius started to defend me, but I rested a hand on his shoulder and quietly stopped him. My chest burned as I watched my son swallow his pride for the woman standing beside him, but my face never changed. Willpower never needs to raise its voice. It waits. I met Devlin's eyes one last time. He saw a broken old man. He never saw the financial force he had just pushed into motion. I rose from my chair. Its legs scraped across the floor, drawing every eye in the ballroom. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply turned and walked into the darkness outside. A second later, Darius abandoned the bride and hurried after me. I already knew Darius had made his choice the moment he followed me out of that ballroom. I reached into my jacket, pulled out my old phone, and dialed the only number that mattered. My assistant answered before the first ring had fully ended. Gone was the quiet voice of a disgraced father. "Begin phase 1, I said, immediately. No anger, no hesitation, just an order. Within 10 minutes, the financial foundation beneath the Sterling Empire would start breaking apart, one crack at a time. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and glanced at the ballroom glowing behind me. They saw an old man in a worn jacket walking away. They never imagined they had just declared war on the wrong person. Darius drove us home without saying a word. The old sedan rattled along the empty road while his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The silence inside the car weighed heavier than anything either of us could say. I looked over just as a tear slid down his face and disappeared into the darkness. He had walked away from the woman he loved because he refused to abandon his father. The Sterlings hadn't only humiliated me, they had used my son's love to strip away his dignity in front of hundreds of people. Rowan had watched him with absolute certainty, convinced he would always crawl back to her no matter how badly she treated him. If he didn't, she believed she could replace him without a second thought. She never realized I had noticed every smile, every glance, every calculated insult. By the time she understood what she had unleashed, it would already be too late. We pulled up outside my weathered wooden house. The sagging porch, peeling paint, and moss-covered roof looked exactly the way the Sterling family imagined my life had ended. Darius stepped out slowly, stared at the house, then turned to me with guilt written all over his face. He apologized for everything that had happened and promised we'd rebuild together, even if all we had left were our own hands. I answered with a quiet nod, rested my hand on his shoulder, and led him through the dusty living room into the kitchen. Behind an old cabinet filled with chipped dishes was something no visitor had ever found. I pressed my palm against a hidden biometric scanner. A hydraulic hiss echoed through the room as a steel door slid open, revealing a staircase descending beneath the house. Darius stopped cold, staring at me as though he'd never known the man who raised him. We walked downstairs, and the darkness vanished as rows of LED lights flickered to life. The underground level looked nothing like the house above it. 12 massive screens covered the walls, alive with market data, financial reports, and streams of green code updating in real time. This wasn't a bunker. It was the command center of Bennett Global Holdings, the place where billions of dollars moved across global markets every day, while the world believed I was just another forgotten old man living on the edge of town. I stepped toward the screens as their glow reflected across my face. The broken father from Table 44 no longer existed. Here, I wasn't the man they mocked. I was the one moving every piece on the board. Behind me, Darius stood frozen, unable to take his eyes off the truth that had been hidden from him his entire life. Darius stood speechless, his eyes locked on the numbers racing across the screens. "Dad, what is all this?" he whispered. I met his gaze without raising my voice. "Real wealth doesn't announce itself," I said. "It stays hidden until the moment it matters. And the richest man is often the one patient enough to let everyone else underestimate him." I hadn't kept this life secret to impress him. I had done it so he would grow into a man whose character was worth more than his bank account. "Thorn," I said. The main display came alive, revealing my assistant's face. He nodded immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Bennett. Clear every debt in Darius's name." Done. Within seconds, every loan, balance, and financial obligation tied to my son disappeared. Darius stared at the screen in disbelief, but I wasn't finished. "Now freeze every personal credit line belonging to the Sterling family." Thornton didn't ask why. Confirmed. Across the city, the black cards Rowan and Devlin flashed with pride only hours earlier were already becoming worthless pieces of plastic. I didn't want to embarrass them for a few minutes. I wanted them to experience what it felt like when money, the only thing they truly respected, vanished overnight. Revenge driven by anger burns fast. Revenge built on patience never misses its target. Tonight was only the first move. Darius remained rooted to the floor, surrounded by 12 towering screens overflowing with live market data. The silence inside the command center felt alive, heavy with the kind of power that never needed applause. I crossed the steel floor toward the central console. Every insult from the wedding had already been stripped of emotion and turned into something far more useful: focus. The Sterling financial structure filled the largest screen. Every company, account, loan, and partnership mapped out before me. To most people, it looked untouchable. To me, it looked fragile. One precise move in the right place would send the entire structure collapsing under its own weight. Darius stepped closer, still trying to understand the man standing in front of him. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked quietly. "Why did we live like we had nothing?" I looked at my son and answered with the truth I had protected for years. "Because I wanted you to know who you were before you knew what you owned. I wanted you to respect hard work, understand struggle, and judge people by their character instead of their status. Money can buy comfort, but it can also blind people to what's real. I wanted him to find someone who loved the man, not the fortune behind his name." "The loudest people are usually hiding the emptiest lives," I continued. "Real power stays quiet because it has nothing to prove." The Sterling family had spent years decorating themselves with wealth, while exposing exactly who they were inside. Their arrogance had simply saved me the trouble of discovering the truth. I turned back toward the console. Thorn, I said. Begin phase 2. Ready, sir. Lock every remaining line of credit connected to the Sterling family and every company under their personal guarantees. Executing now. Commands raced across the screens. Somewhere in the city, Rowan was probably dreaming about the luxury honeymoon she planned to enjoy without the poor husband she believed she had already outgrown. She had no idea. The life she expected to wake up to was disappearing one transaction at a time. Rowan probably went to bed convinced she'd simply trade one husband for another, richer one. By morning, she'd discover that every black card she loved flashing across marble counters had become nothing more than dead plastic. That wasn't punishment. It was a warning. Darius watched the words "executed" appear in red across the main screen. For the first time that night, I saw something change in his eyes. The broken groom who had walked away from the altar was gone. In his place stood a man beginning to understand what real influence looked like. From this day forward, I told him, you'll never have to lower your head to anyone again. Just remember, power is a tool, not an identity. Use it to stop people like the Sterlings. Never become one of them. He nodded without taking his eyes off the screens. I pulled up the Sterling corporate structure. It looked impressive on paper, but I knew exactly what was holding it together. Debt. Layer upon layer of borrowed money disguised as success. Every luxury project, every commercial tower, every expansion depended on financing. And the final owner of those obligations was me. We weren't destroying their empire with headlines or police raids. We were quietly cutting off its oxygen. The collapse wouldn't happen in one dramatic moment. It would spread like cracks through glass until the entire structure shattered under its own weight. I rested a hand on Darius's shoulder. Get some sleep, I said. Tomorrow is when the real fight begins. He left without another word. Once the door closed, I remained alone in the command center, watching a live security image of the Sterling mansion glowing on one of the monitors. They were still celebrating, still drinking expensive wine, still convinced they buried a helpless old man. I couldn't help smiling. They had no idea they had just signed the first page of their own downfall. That night, they slept on silk sheets. It would be the last peaceful night they ever enjoyed. By sunrise, the command center smelled of fresh coffee instead of dust. Darius returned, looking different. The grief was still there, but it no longer controlled him. His attention was fixed on the screen, where Sterling Corporation's stock price had begun sliding into the red. I stood beside him with my hands tucked into my old jacket. Remember this, I said. Revenge isn't about using control. It's about taking control. The Sterlings chose humiliation as their weapon. We would answer with facts. I opened a file containing Devlin Sterling's creditors. Company after company appeared on the screen. Darius frowned as he read through the names. Most of these belong to us, he said. More than 70%, I replied. They just don't know it yet. He looked at me. So what's next? A faint smile crossed my face. Never stop your enemy while he's making mistakes. Give him more room and he'll bury himself. Devlin had spent years believing expensive suits, luxury parties, and influential friends made him untouchable. He mistook borrowed prestige for real power. Soon, he discovered those same relationships were built on money that no longer existed. Hidden power doesn't stand under spotlights. It waits in the shadows until the perfect moment to move. Real power is like the ocean, I told Darius. You rarely see the current that sinks the ship. I'd spent decades building this network in silence, living like an ordinary man while my influence stretched across industries and continents. Remaining invisible had never been a sacrifice. It had been the strategy. When the day finally came to reveal myself, the outcome would already be decided. Darius looked at me differently now. At last, he understood that the faded jacket and cheap suit were never signs of failure. They were bait, a simple test of character. The Sterlings had failed it spectacularly. Rowan chose a $50,000 wedding dress over loyalty. Devlin chose arrogance over decency. Now they would lose the two things they worshipped most: money and reputation. I tapped a key on the console. Thorne appeared instantly. Status report. Partner banks have begun demanding early repayment, sir, he replied. Sterling executives are scrambling. Internal panic is spreading. I nodded. Good. That's only the beginning. I turned to Darius. We're not here just to take their fortune. We're going to show the world exactly who they are. This wasn't revenge for a single night of humiliation. It was justice for years of believing wealth placed them above everyone else. It was for your mother, who taught us that humility is worth more than status. She believed kindness outlives fortune, and today, the Sterlings would learn why. I looked back at the main display as another notification appeared. A massive short position against Sterling Corporation had just gone live. The first tremor had reached the foundation. Before long, the entire castle would start shaking. Then another screen caught Darius's attention. Rowan was streaming live from a room filled with roses, dressed in white, tears running perfectly down her cheeks. Thousands of viewers flooded the chat with sympathy as she painted herself as the abandoned bride. She claimed Darius had mistreated her, humiliated her, and walked away without reason. Every lie earned another wave of support. Darius's fists tightened until his knuckles turned white. She's lying, he said, taking a step toward the screen as if he could stop it himself. I rested a hand on his shoulder. Let her talk. He looked at me in disbelief. The fastest way to destroy a liar is to let them finish the story. Rowan believed social media was protecting her. She had no idea she was performing on a stage I controlled. Thorne, I said calmly, prepare the package. Already queued, sir. A small smile crossed my face. Rowan thought she was building public sympathy. In reality, she was building the height from which she would fall. She spoke proudly about her designer wedding dress, as though marrying into our family had been some act of charity. She described our modest life as if poverty were a disease. Every sentence revealed more about her than it did about us. Darius looked at me again. Why don't we expose everything now? Because timing is part of the verdict, I answered. You don't stop your enemy while they're making a mistake. You let them go all in. We'd let Rowan collect every compliment, every donation, every word of public support. We'd let her believe she'd won. Then, at the exact moment she felt untouchable, we'd erase the ground beneath her feet. Over the years, I'd learned that money and information were the two most powerful weapons in the world. The Sterlings had spent their lives using wealth to hide the truth. They were about to discover what happened when someone controlled both. The Sterlings believed everything could be bought: influence, loyalty, respect, even the truth. They were wrong. Some things only grow stronger the more money you throw at them. Integrity was one of them, and the truth, revealed at exactly the right moment, was worth more than any fortune. Thorne, I said, pull every security angle from the Grand Hotel. Within seconds, dozens of camera feeds filled the screens. There I was, sitting quietly at table 44, while Rowan mocked me, Devlin raised his glass, and hundreds of guests laughed along. No editing, no narration, just the truth. Archive everything, I ordered. Well, let the world judge for itself. Rowan thought her live stream would shape public opinion. She had no idea it was about to become the courtroom where she would be convicted. I glanced at Darius. The rage that had driven him only hours earlier was fading. In its place was something far more dangerous: discipline. He was beginning to understand what it meant to carry the Bennett name. We didn't chase revenge with emotion. We built it with evidence. We stood together inside the command center, preparing the first strike against the Sterling family's reputation. Unlike money, a ruined reputation rarely recovers. Before I could issue the next order, a red notification flashed across the largest screen. Catherine Sterling admitted to St. Jude Hospital. Seconds later, another live feed appeared. Devlin Sterling stood in the hospital lobby, surrounded by cameras, his eyes wet, his voice heavy with practiced grief. He claimed the stress caused by my family's cruelty had given his wife a stroke. He called us heartless, invisible killers. I couldn't help smiling. It was an amateur performance. The Sterlings had always assumed hospitals, reporters, and public sympathy were simply assets waiting to be purchased. Thorne? I asked. Who holds St. Jude's debt? He answered immediately. An investment fund registered in Singapore, sir. Beneficial owner? Bennett Capital. I nodded once. Acquire the remaining outstanding debt within the hour. I want operational control. Already in progress. Darius looked at me in disbelief. You can buy a hospital that fast? No, I replied calmly. I don't need to buy the hospital. I only need to own what keeps it alive. A few signatures later, every internal security feed and digital record became available on our screens. Meanwhile, Devlin continued delivering his emotional speech, praising Rowan as a devoted daughter and Catherine as an innocent victim. Then Thorne opened the live feed from the hospital's VIP suite. Darius leaned closer and froze. Catherine wasn't lying in bed surrounded by doctors. She was dancing with a glass of expensive red wine in her hand. Rowan stood beside her, laughing as they celebrated what they believed was another flawless performance. There wasn't a single medical monitor attached to either of them. No oxygen tubes, no emergency treatment, just champagne smiles behind a locked door. I exhaled slowly. It's time. Thorne didn't need further instructions. Seconds later, the VIP security footage replaced the hospital logo on every display screen behind Devlin's press conference. His speech stopped mid-sentence. Reporters turned toward the giant monitors as Catherine and Rowan laughed, toasted their glasses, and congratulated each other for fooling the public. The lobby fell silent for one long heartbeat. Then camera shutters exploded like gunfire. Devlin slowly turned around. The color drained from his face as he watched his entire story collapse behind him in real time. His wife wasn't dying. She was celebrating, and every network in the country was broadcasting it live. Devlin lunged toward the screens, waving his arms as if he could erase the truth with his hands. It was useless. The footage had already spread across every major network and social platform. Once the truth escapes, there's no putting it back in the cage. I watched everything unfold from the command center without satisfaction or anger, only calm. Justice rarely arrives on its own. Sometimes someone has to force the door open. The Sterlings had spent years treating people like disposable pieces on a chessboard, convinced they could control every narrative. They never imagined those same lies would tighten around their own necks. But the hospital was only the opening blow. Their reputation had cracked. Next, their empire would. I looked at Darius. He didn't celebrate. He simply nodded, finally understanding that real battles are won long before the public notices them. Truth always has a price. The question is, who ends up paying it? 1 week later, Devlin Sterling looked nothing like the confident man who had mocked me at the wedding. His company's stock kept falling. Banks were closing in. Investors were disappearing. Desperation had replaced arrogance, and desperate men always look for a miracle. I already knew where he'd go. Pine Ridge Golf Club. Deals worth hundreds of millions changed hands there over quiet conversations and perfectly trimmed fairways. I arrived an hour early, wearing the same faded work jacket and old jeans. Standing beneath an oak tree, I watched luxury cars roll through the gates while executives greeted one another with polished smiles that never reached their eyes. Wealth doesn't eliminate fear. It simply hides it behind expensive watches. Devlin finally arrived with 3 potential investors at his side. He laughed, shook hands, and spoke confidently about expansion plans that would never happen. Then he spotted me. His smile disappeared instantly. He broke away from the group and marched straight toward me. "What are you doing here?" he snapped, looking me up and down with open disgust. "Stealing from the golf club now?" I said nothing. Silence has a way of making arrogant people louder. Devlin took another step closer. Get out before I have security drag you off this property, he barked. Then he turned toward the investors and pointed at me. This is exactly what's wrong with society. People like him think they belong everywhere. He believed humiliating me would impress the men standing beside him. He never realized he was stepping onto the trap I'd prepared. A few seconds later, the club manager came running across the fairway, breathing hard. Devlin smiled with satisfaction. Perfect timing, he said. Remove this man immediately. The manager barely acknowledged him. Instead, he stopped in front of me, lowered his head respectfully, and said, Good afternoon, Mr. Bennett. I'm pleased to confirm that the transfer has been completed. As of 15 minutes ago, Pine Ridge Golf Club and all surrounding properties officially belong to you. The entire course went silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Devlin stared at the manager, then back at me, unable to process what he'd just heard. The investors slowly stepped away from him, suddenly far more interested in the man wearing the old jacket than the one in the tailored suit. They had judged us both by appearances. Only one of us had been telling the truth. I closed the distance until I stood directly in front of Devlin. Sweat rolled down his temple as his confidence drained away. You keep looking at clothes, I said quietly. I've been looking at ownership. I glanced toward the fairway stretching behind him. The strongest man in the room isn't the one holding the membership card. It's the one who owns the land beneath everyone else's feet. I turned to the club manager. Please remove Mr. Sterling from my property. There was no hesitation. Within seconds, security surrounded Devlin. He struggled, shouted, and tried to convince the investors that everything was under control, but no one even looked his way. Those men hadn't become wealthy by standing beside failures. They quietly walked away, already searching for safer opportunities. I watched as Devlin was escorted across the immaculate fairway he'd once believed belonged to people like him. In a matter of days, he'd lost his reputation, his financial empire, and now the last thing keeping him upright, his pride. I sat down on a wooden bench overlooking the course and accepted a simple glass of water. Darius joined me, saying nothing for a long moment. Finally, he broke the silence. Now I understand. I looked at him. Understand what? The worst revenge isn't destroying someone, he said. It's leaving them with nothing except the consequences of their own choices. I smiled. He had learned the lesson I wanted him to learn. Violence ends quickly. Consequences can last a lifetime. Together, we watched the Sterling Empire continue falling apart, one decision at a time. Devlin had spent his life believing expensive clothes created powerful men. He was finally discovering that titles, money, and appearances disappear far faster than character. A few days later, Rowan arrived at Bennett Global headquarters. Gone was the confident heiress who had laughed at our table during the wedding. Her designer dress was wrinkled, her makeup streaked, and the confidence that once filled every room had vanished. The moment she entered my office, she dropped to her knees. Through trembling sobs, she admitted she made mistakes and begged for another chance. Then she played what she believed was her strongest card. I'm pregnant, she whispered. It's Darius's child. She asked for $500,000, promising she would disappear forever if we paid her. She thought motherhood would force us to negotiate. She didn't realize she had already lost. I looked at her without emotion, opened my desk drawer, and slid a brown file across the table. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a certified DNA report from one of the country's most respected laboratories. I spoke calmly. You left your hairbrush in our house. You made the testing very easy. Rowan's eyes raced across the pages before all the color drained from her face. The report proved the unborn child wasn't Darius's. The biological father was the personal trainer she'd been seeing just days before the wedding. For the first time since I'd met her, Rowan had nothing to say. Every lie she'd built collapsed in complete silence. I don't hate you anymore, I told her quietly. Hate gives people importance. You don't have that anymore. I didn't see a woman fighting for her future. I saw someone who had traded honesty for luxury until there was nothing left worth saving. Just then, The office door opened. Darius walked inside and stopped a few feet away from the woman he had once planned to marry. He studied her for a moment, but there was no anger left in his eyes. Not even sadness. Only acceptance. "Please remove her," he said to security. "She doesn't belong here anymore." Rowan cried, pleaded, and reached toward him, but he never looked back. The heavy oak doors closed behind her with a final echo that sounded like the end of a long chapter. I turned toward my son. The bitterness was gone from his face. In its place stood a man who finally understood the difference between real value and expensive illusion. Every move had led us here. Every piece was finally where it belonged. Rowan's deception didn't end in my office. Within days, the DNA report reached the courts and every major newspaper. The Sterlings had crossed one line too many by trying to use an innocent child as leverage. There would be no coming back from that. I stood by my office window as the city lights flickered on, knowing the final chapter had already begun. Tomorrow wouldn't be about revenge anymore. It would be about moving forward. The end of the Sterling Empire came quietly. No explosions, no dramatic collapse, just silence inside a corporate boardroom where every decision had already been made. I stood at the head of the table, wearing a simple black suit. Across from me sat Devlin Sterling. Only weeks earlier, he'd looked down on me as if I were invisible. Now, he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a matter of days. A bankruptcy notice rested in front of him. Every account had been frozen. His mansion was under foreclosure. His luxury cars had been repossessed. Every remaining asset had already been acquired through companies under my control. I hadn't bought them to expand my wealth. I'd bought them so the Sterling name would disappear from the city's business landscape forever. I looked Devlin in the eye. "Your biggest mistake wasn't making bad investments," I said. "It was believing you could humiliate decent people without consequences." Rowan stood quietly in the corner. The woman who had once flaunted a $50,000 wedding gown now wore an inexpensive shirt she'd likely bought in a hurry. Her public image had collapsed along with her family's fortune. The DNA report had spread everywhere. To the public, she was no longer a socialite. She had become the face of betrayal. Darius stepped forward carrying one final folder and placed it in front of Devlin. Inside was a complete criminal case built from everything Thorne had uncovered: financial fraud, tax evasion, falsified records, and years of illegal transactions. The evidence was overwhelming. Devlin's hand shook as he signed the documents, transferring what little remained of his empire. When he finished, he looked up at me with hollow eyes. "Why?" he asked. "Why take everything?" I leaned forward just enough for him to hear every word. "Because men like you keep believing kindness is weakness." I paused. "I did it for every person you treated like they were beneath you. I did it for my son. And I did it because sooner or later, every empire built on humiliation collapses under its own weight." The room fell silent. A moment later, the doors opened, and police officers walked in. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed through the boardroom as they placed Devlin under arrest. He didn't resist. There was nothing left to fight for. Rowan collapsed into a chair, crying uncontrollably as the last pieces of her world disappeared. Neither Darius nor I looked back. Together, we walked out of the building that had carried the Sterling name for decades, knowing it never would again. The next morning, the Sterling name was already disappearing from the city. In its place would stand a children's foundation bearing my late wife's name. The revenge was over. What came next mattered far more. We hadn't fought to build another empire. We had fought to reclaim our dignity. Everything ended the way I'd always hoped it would. Not with applause, but with peace. A few days later, I sat on the porch of my old wooden house. No crystal chandeliers. No expensive banquets. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees and the scent of rain lingering in the earth. In my hand was a $5 cup of roadside coffee. It was simple, bitter, and completely honest. Somehow, It tasted better than every glass of vintage wine I'd ever been served in the Sterling mansion. That mansion was no longer theirs. Workers had already removed the polished brass name from the front gate. Soon, the property would welcome children instead of pride, exactly as my wife would have wanted. Devlin spent his days behind prison walls, while Rowan started over in a small town, working long shifts as a waitress. Life has a way of teaching lessons money never can. Sometimes the greatest punishment is living the life you once looked down on. Darius stepped onto the porch carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee. He sat beside me in a plain shirt, looking lighter than I'd seen him in years. After a long silence, he smiled. "Now I understand why you chose this life," he said. I looked at him, waiting. "Power isn't something you show people," he continued. "It's something you use to protect them." I nodded. The storm had taken away the naive young man who once measured his future through someone else's love. In his place sat a man who understood the weight that comes with real strength. "Never let anyone decide your value by your bank account," I told him. "A tailored suit can hide a cruel heart, and an old work jacket can hide a king." Too many people spend their lives judging what they can see. They mistake appearances for character and wealth for worth. The Sterlings made that mistake until the very end. We didn't just recover our fortune, we recovered something far more valuable: our honor. Looking back, I realized I had never lived like a poor man because I lacked wealth. I chose that life so my son would grow up with compassion instead of entitlement. And when the moment finally arrived, I showed him that real power belongs to those who know when not to use it, and when they finally must. The coffee had gone cold in my hands, but I hardly noticed. For the first time in years, everything felt quiet inside me. The anger was gone. Only gratitude remained. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the fields in deep shades of gold and red, I thought about my wife. I'd made her a promise long ago to protect our son and raise him into a man she would be proud of. At last, I had kept that promise. Darius stood, and together we walked back toward the house. We left the shadows behind us, not because we had won, but because we no longer needed to fight. The future waiting beyond that front door belonged to honest people, and this time, that was more than enough.